Good afternoon, and welcome to the Council of the Americas, Americas Society. This afternoon, we really have a great pleasure to have a public panel with the G20 on the Argentine presidency and finance track Sherpas. I want to thank our partner in this program, the Fundación Embajada Abierta, and I want to give a special welcome to a variety of different people. First of all, I want to welcome Ambassador Pedro Villagra Delgado, and he is Argentina's Sherpa in front of the G20, and he has quite an interesting job ahead of him this year. I'd like to welcome Laura Jaitman, the G20 Finance Deputy from the Ministry of the Treasury of Argentina. I'd like to welcome Jorge Argüello, President, Fundación Embajada Abierta, and Claudio Corte, who's in the audience, Deputy Consul General of Argentina. I want to thank our Argentine series sponsors, and I just want to say I also want to welcome all of the people that are joining us today by webcast. And I think in the rain, you get a lot of people on webcast, fewer people in person. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to my dear friend Jorge, who's going to moderate today's panel and I guess introduce the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. As I told you, I'm very happy to be back in New York, very happy to be back at the Council of the Americas once again. As you all know, the G20 is a process. As Pedro Villagra Delgado likes to say, it's an open mechanism that is called to work all over the year. So it's not just the summit we see normally every November, but it's a working process that goes all over the year. So what we are doing now matters because of that, because we are part of that mechanism that is going on. So the success of the Argentinian presidency will be to keep the G20 on track. When I say on track, I mean functioning, I mean discussing, I mean agreeing as much as possible, but being able to guarantee a forum where the leaders can personally meet, can share their different points of view, and face and try to solve efficiently the many problems that this unstable and changing world is providing us. Of course, we want to reach an effective outcome in Buenos Aires this November. For that, we must continue to address the G20 agenda from all possible perspectives and at every possible venue. This is what we are doing now. This is what we are doing today. The man responsible to keep the G20 on track is sitting next to me. It's Ambassador Pedro Villagra Delgado. He's an experienced Argentinian diplomat who knows very well what multilateralism means because he has worked a lot on the issue. So I will first give the floor to Ambassador Villagra Delgado. Pedro, please.
Okay. Good afternoon to all of you, and thank you for coming in a day which is quite fraught with rain and floods and everything else, but also with a bit of sunshine, and I hope that you'll bring a bit of sunshine also to illuminate the track of the G20 in the future. As you know, the G20 is a mechanism, it's an informal mechanism, as Jorge just said, of leaders. And I think this is something that we have to keep in mind. It was created in 1999 at the level of ministers of finance and central bankers to give a response to the financial crisis of Asia in those years before, the end of the 90s, and elevated to the summit level in 2008 with the global financial crisis, with the purpose basically of providing stability and governance to the finance and macroeconomics. And it still is like that. That's the core business of the G20, even though when it was elevated to the summit level in 2008, was because of the crisis was of such magnitude that was thought to be necessary to have politics coming into and giving a political direction to the decisions that were taken. And we cannot do a counterfactual history, but the reality is that the crisis that was happening in 2008 until 2010-11 had all the components to have been a crisis similar to the one in 1929, 1930, with all the results that we saw. And it didn't happen because the countries that participated in the mechanism, I'm not saying that it was just because of the G20, certainly, but the countries that were members of the G20, in the decisions that they took at that time, they sort of postponed some of the actions, the competitive actions that could have undermined each other, trying to get advantages with just short-term for each of them. Instead, there was a cooperative approach which actually worked. If the crisis was averted in these catastrophic consequences that could have had because of the G20 remains to be seen, but the fact is that it happened. And they were the measures that the G20 adopted at the time in terms of the regulations of the financial market, reasonable regulation, I'm not talking about constraints, the need to avoid protectionism, the actions that were of a prudential nature that had led to the crisis because they were missing or they were not sufficient until 2008, were actually adopted, and that's why, in a way, the G20 contributed significantly to that. At the present juncture, there was a couple of, until very recently, the idea that there were not any, and that is still the case, not any financial crisis looming in the horizon, so there was a certain sort of taking the G20 as sort of a routine kind of exercise. Now we have some questions that are of interest, obviously, the difference between countries regarding how trade should be approached, and probably the G20 becomes again a sort of mechanism in which these things have to be, the opportunity to be discussed there, not with in the nitty-gritty of what the WTO and other international organizations with the specific mandates have to do, but in generally discussing at the leaders, at the top of these 20 odd members of the G20, what should be done, what are the actions globally, conceptually, that have to be taken in to create again a system which benefits all and which is more cooperative than competitive. One of the things that we have to keep in mind and in the way that the G20 carries out its mandate is that the G20 is not an implementation mechanism in the sense that the decisions are done by the G20. But if these countries that integrate the G20, which represent a significant portion of the world's GDP, world's population, and world's landmass, but on top of that, they have played historically, all of them in the different levels, of course, and the different importance, a very important systemic role in the rules that have been adopted for the international community in the last 60, 70 years. They can, if they agree in things that they have to do in common, they can bring those agreements into operation through the different international bodies, be the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, the FAO, ILO, WTO, and you name it, but also, and more importantly, I would say, domestically. Because at the end of the day, many of these measures, the measures that I mentioned that were adopted or agreed, more than adopted, in the G20 in 2008, 2009, 2010, were implemented in each of the financial systems of each country. But there were some common trends, common lines, and those are the ones that I think the G20 is there to provide. The G20 does not intend to be a sort of a superseder of the UN or other international bodies. Even we don't say that we represent other countries, we don't indeed, but the actions that the G20 takes or the action in which they agree upon are by definition of a global nature, and therefore they will have eventually an impact if implemented in other countries. And that's why in the Argentine presidency, and previous presidents have done the same, We do activities of outreach, going to the ones that are not sitting around the table of the G20, and not just to tell them what we intend to do in the G20, but also to listen to what they think might be relevant for whatever they do or for their development. In the Argentine G20, we have the motto of the Argentine G20 is building consensus for a fair and sustainable development. Building consensus because we know that consensus in the G20 has been broken. In Hamburg, there were a couple of areas where there was no consensus between the members. And we think that part of the job that Argentina will try to put in practice during our presidency will be to try to rebuild those consensuses in which, where are the red lines for each of the countries of the G20 in which we can advance up to a certain point and not beyond that, and see how can we reconstruct this spirit of cooperation between all the members, which is still there to a large extent, but there are some differences have emerged in some areas which you are familiar by just reading the papers, and this is something that we will do our best to try to get everyone again on agreeing on basic principles that have to do with the governance and the stability of the world, in the finance and macroeconomic things, basically, but the social and political issues that come into the G20 are those who affect that. I mean, the G20 is not a mechanism for discussing matters of international security, for instance, which we have other fora for that, including the UN, of course. And also the other element is the fair and sustainable development that is crucial for us, and I'm talking about Argentina, that the president has said, President Macri has insisted that we want to do a G20 which is people-centered. I mean, things that really, whatever the G20 does, has an impact, a positive impact in real people. And for that, we all are conscious that a fair and sustainable development is crucial. When you see the world around, it's quite obvious that you have that there is this inequality gap that is growing all over the world, and that inequality gap needs to be addressed. And that one of the things when you take, Laura will then speak about the priorities and that Argentina has, including the ones on the Sherpa track. And these, for us, the important thing is that when you build this financial the stability that we need in the world to develop this. I thought that there was something that they were telling me they were telling me that I should stop, but I didn't. I mean, that's a good training that you need to have in the G20, a Sherpa, because you have to put your best stone face and keep on, carry on, and that's it. But eventually, no. But I say, well, I'll stop here. It's just the importance is that when I was, my first job as a diplomat was abroad, was the mission to the UN here in New York. And in the mission in New York, when we took matters of development in the 80s, you were talking about developing countries, clearly. Nowadays, when you have the SDGs, the Agenda 2030, and if we all, in honesty, we read the 17 chapters of Agenda 2030, you realize that many of those chapters apply to a growing number of people, even in developed countries. So in that sense, that's bad news, obviously, because there are things that are not going very well. But on the other hand, it's a good thing in the sense that we are all directly interested in getting these development goals moving ahead, because it will benefit everyone. We have to close, as I said, the inequality gap, and not a sort of a theoretical things. We have to do it with things that are practical, not just big ideas. That's why Laura will refer more to the concrete aspect we're doing. Another thing that we are doing in the Argentine presidency is working very close together, the finance and the Sherpa track. Because sometimes there is this tendency putting the two in separate spaces, and actually we're doing the same thing from a different perspective, and that's a critical issue, and that's why you will see us during the Argentine presidency practically the whole time, the finance and the Sherpa's tracks working together, and that's something that we will stress. I will stop here. I think it's because the important thing will be to get also your reactions and your questions. So, Laura.
Thank you very much, Pedro. One of the things I like of Pedro's leadership is his capacity to lead teams. Laura Jaitman is a crucial component of the Sherpa's team. This young woman is an experienced economist in Argentina. She is the G20 Finance Deputy at the Argentine Ministry of Treasury. In this role, Laura leads the G20 Finance Deputies under Argentina's G20 presidency. So I will invite Laura to share with us what the main priorities of the Argentina agenda in that field are. Please.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you all of you for coming and for following the webcast. My role as G20 Finance Deputy is to carry the work of the finance track. I represent Minister Duhovne from the Treasury. We have deputies meeting and ministers, finance ministers and central bank governors meetings. And as Pedro mentioned, the finance track works very closely with the Sherpa track in our presidency. And that is very important because we have 3 priorities in the presidency. Most of them are cross-cutting across the 2 tracks. The priorities of the presidency are the future of work, are financing infrastructure, and food security, a sustainable food security that has to do with global value chains, and that one is hosted in the Sherpa track. While the future of work and infrastructure financing are involved more so in infrastructure financing in the finance track. And also the gender priority is across all the work streams that we are working on in this year's presidency. So, as Pedro mentioned, the motto of the presidency of building consensus for a fair and sustainable development is kind of the spirit and the approach of our overall presidency, and it is very connected to President Macri's idea of insertion of Argentina to the world and reigniting regional and bilateral relationships in a smart way, in a cooperative way, and opening the economy. And the G20 is a milestone in this very ambitious international agenda, and also accompanied by the not less ambitious national agenda of restoring the rule of law and doing macroeconomic reforms to make growth more sustainable and long-lasting. So with this in the background, the presidency of the G20 is a huge challenge that Argentina takes with a lot of responsibility, with a lot of honor and humility as well, and to carry many innovations, not only in terms of the subject matters, but also in terms of processes. So talking to all the members is key for our presidency, and this building consensus. So there are, as you know, a couple of issues this year in which we have to build consensus on. So talking to all the members, representing emerging markets, this voice from the South is a core of our presidency. And also in the content, so our priorities that we especially work on in the finance track, the future of work, and infrastructure are very important for countries like Argentina, but also got a lot of support with developed countries that also face these challenges in different degrees. I'll tell you a bit about what we aim at in these priorities, and then I'll open the floor for questions. So first, on the future of work, as you know, technology presents a lot of opportunities, and ministers in our last ministerial meeting in March agreed that the message is very optimistic, that there are many opportunities, because as we saw in previous technological revolutions, we saw in the long run increases in growth, in the living standards, in productivity. However, in the transition, there are challenges that we have to tackle. So the idea of this priority is to embrace these opportunities to make them work for all. Inclusive growth is something very important in the finance track. Ministers already agreed on kind of a diagnosis of the potential and current impacts of technology, and we will be working on different policy options for the diversity of the members, taking into account their degree of development and of penetration of technology. And the idea, ultimately, is that leaders can show the citizens that they understand the concerns, that they see plenty of opportunities, and that they are prepared to embrace these opportunities and to tackle the mid-term challenges, mainly distributional. Then on infrastructure financing, what we see is that there is a huge infrastructure gap that affects not only developing countries, but also developed countries. Because many members of the G20 are large countries like ours that are very diverse, heterogeneous in terms of access to infrastructure, not only physical, but also digital infrastructure that nowadays is very important. So we see this gap, but we also see a lot of resources, private resources in the hands of institutional investors that are looking for investment opportunities, longer-term investment opportunities, being infrastructure, one field in which they seem to be interested in. So what in the finance track we are doing in this priority is trying to build the financial vehicle to channel these private resources into infrastructure financing of public infrastructure projects. Technically, what we want to achieve is to develop infrastructure as an asset class, which is very ambitious and which not be done in this presidency, but Argentina already in the last ministerial meeting endorsed a roadmap, the direction with the building blocks to develop infrastructure as an asset class, and we are working very closely with Japan, the next G20 president, for which infrastructure is also important, to keep on working on this priority. And there are some parts of this roadmap that we are seeking to achieve with tangible deliverables this year. And for sure, gender is very important, these considerations also in the future of work, and when we talk about infrastructure that we are working on. So in the finance track, apart from these priorities, we receive the breadth of the legacy agenda, and we are being very strategic in picking which issues we want to discuss by ministers this year to keep the G20 the most relevant forum for international coordination and cooperation.
Thank you very much, Laura. You have been so clear. From now on, what I'm going to do is to open the floor. So I invite you to make comments or make questions, etc. Would you please? We need Pablo. Sí.
Thank you. My name's Larry Bridwell. I teach international business at Pace University here in New York. And my question is, for what I've been reading, I just met with Parag Khanna in Singapore last week, who's written a book called Connectography, and he emphasizes global supply chains. And I was intrigued that you said that this is part of the G20 agenda. And Asia's become famous for high-quality infrastructure, particularly in the context of ports, to send the goods to the rest of the world. And in Latin America, particularly in Brazil, there is concern that the infrastructure is not good enough to be part of global supply chains. So Laura, in terms of, you mentioned this, I'm just wondering if you could give more details on how the G20 is going to pursue this subject of infrastructure in the context of enabling Latin America to participate in global supply chains with better infrastructure.
Thank you very much for the question. That's a great one. And as you mentioned, many countries have good examples on working on infrastructure. also in the context of the G20. So China, for example, when they were presidents, they were developing an initiative of connectivity, which is something you mentioned. Also Australia was working on infrastructure. So our work is building on past presidents to develop this infrastructure as an asset class. So this year we are concentrating in this very specific and technical financial issue of building this, developing this asset class. And under the roadmap that I mentioned before, there are some parts that are related on what you mentioned. For example, quality infrastructure is something that we will start this year and will continue working under Japanese presidency, for which quality infrastructure, as you very well mentioned, is a priority, and they are leading this agenda. This year, in concrete, what we are doing for this priority in terms of advancing this roadmap is to work on better project preparation, because infrastructure is a very intricate project with very heterogeneous projects, and to develop this asset class, what you need is that they can be compared at a low cost by investors, and the risk will be assessed. So what we will work on specifically this year is more on project preparation, and to see which are the best practices that then can be converted into principles that may be applied to the diversity of members. Also in the financial contract standardization, so more in the financial part than in the implementation part of infrastructure projects and connecting Latin America. And also on data that is very important on infrastructure, and that is an issue that is fundamental to assess the profits of the infrastructure projects, and to be able to assess also the risks and develop this asset class. On the global value chain itself, we are not working this year, but what we have in mind and the underlying driver of this priority is that what we want ultimately is to boost investment in infrastructure for that and for other purposes, for connecting the countries, within the countries. Argentina now is implementing its most ambitious infrastructure plan ever, so it's something that is in the core of President Macri agenda and the national agenda. So those considerations are underlying this effort of enabling more private sector capital into infrastructure projects. I don't know if you want to talk about the food security issues and the global change?
No, just I think that your question is a very pertinent one, because one of the things that we have to keep in mind in the G20 is that the solutions that we provide have to be global, basically, and it's not just. Of course, Latin America, we're very much interested in the infrastructure that we need. And frankly, having lived in New York in the 80s, you need some here as well. I mean, it's not a matter, well, that's right, no, but then there is the other kind of infrastructure. It's not just the hard infrastructure, if we put it in the name, but connectivity as well. And the same applies to Latin America, to Africa, and to other places. So it is an important element that we have to keep in mind. And what Laura was saying, the only area where we are focusing specifically on global value chains is in the agriculture thing, in the food production. We want to focus on how to get a better participation of food production in global value chains, because that will provide also some to help in securing a food security for the world, not just in the sense of having a nutritious, abundant, and healthy food, but also how this can be integrated in the production around the globe.
Thank you, Pedro. Is there any other question? Yes, good, please. There you have the mic.
Hello, Patrick Gillespie with Bloomberg. I'm wondering, can you talk, at the G20 ministerial meeting in March, there was not consensus on trade. There's growing trade tensions between China and the United States. Can the G20 in November truly be a forum for consensus on trade?
Well, in fact, there was consensus in trade in the ministerial in Buenos Aires. There was a paragraph that was approved in the communique, but that was Laura's.
Battling protectionism was not. Battling protectionism was not a part of the G20.
No. But
communique.
well, she will explain. There was something better than people expect.
So, of course, we had a discussion on the main concerns to the global economy, the main risks that ministers and governors raised, being inward-looking policies, one of those, financial vulnerability is another one, and on trade in particular, there was a very positive message in terms of working together towards a better exchange, a better system that works for all. And what is reflected in the communique is this positive message that I think we achieve a very good language in terms of trade, in terms of first, as you can notice, the communique is our main vehicle of communication with the people, and Argentina, as we want the G20 People Center, we also in the communique had lines that could resonate with the people. And on trade, there is one where we express the benefits of trade to improve living standards, growth, productivity. So that's very clear, and there was a consensus on that. Then, more G20 technically, we reaffirm what leaders stated in Hamburg, and that is a positive declaration on trade. But also we went one step forward because the world is different than in Hamburg, and in the communique you can see that it is reflected in a phrase where we recognize that we need more dialogue and actions to strengthen the contribution of trade to our economies. So there was a consensus and an overall positive message on trade, and also on the need to work together towards a better contribution of trade to the economy.
You are right in the sense that we are not back in Hangzhou, obviously, because there have been some changes, and but the question of the protectionism was included in the Hamburg language. Going back to that, which of course is not the ideal, but it is something that is better than people expected. Building up into the future, how we are going to go to the end of the year, and particularly to the Leaders Summit, it is true. Trade is a critical issue, obviously, and this is one of the areas when I mentioned that Argentina will try to get a consensus. This is one of the areas in which certainly we know that it's going to be one of the defining aspects of our presidency, and we will strive to do that. But we have also to keep in mind that we have to do the things that are possible, and that's there was a big change in the perceptions within the G20 between the Chinese presidency and Hamburg, because in the meantime there were some political changes, and political changes is something we have to live with. That's reality, and at the end of the day, changes take place in most countries of the G20. They take place by changes through the electoral system, and that's fine. I mean, you have to deal with that. One of the things that we have to keep in the G20 is the flexibility enough to be able to adapt to what the reality of the world is providing. We have to work, of course, towards Argentina is convinced that protectionism is not good and trade is good, provided it is a rules-based system and multilateral. But we have to, if there are discrepancies about that used to be a sort of the general credo of everyone, we have to discuss it. And that's precisely why the G20 is a relevant forum for that. It is the leaders of the most important countries in terms of the systemic role they play and all the other things that I mentioned at the beginning that are sitting in that table, and they can, if there are problems, which there are, we know that there are, that's a very good place that gives an opportunity to trash those problems out.
I see 2, 3 more questions, so I will start with the lady in the raise your hand, please. Okay. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. I'm Laura Flores, Director of the Americas Division of the Department of Political Affairs in the UN. Thank you so much for this presentation. Hi, Susan. G20 certainly has a systemic role to play in providing the stability, the economy, the finance markets in our region, in the world. In our region, we have a very pressing issue that borders more on the political issue. So apologies for asking this question, but it's very important for Latin America and the Caribbean. And I wonder, especially since President Macri is making this presidency a people-centered agenda. Will the G20 play a role in any way in the response to various countries' requests for the IMF and the World Bank to provide support to those countries in the region, Caribbean, Latin America, that are requiring support, economic, finance, in terms of the inflow of Venezuelans moving in our region? Thank you.
Well, the specific situations of different countries, you know that the G20 is a consensus mechanism. And you can see by the composition of the G20 and imagine that there are some things that will not be conducive to consensus. I think this is something we have to do in Latin America. It hasn't been done. There were some pronouncements in the Summit of the Americas now in Lima. But this is probably not a subject to the G20. What we are doing, many of us, is acting practically in what to do in the problem that you refer. But certainly, we have to keep in mind which is the agenda of the G20, which is of a global nature, essentially.
Thank you very much. I'm Philip Goff. I'm from the Brazilian mission here to the United Nations. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that the priorities that the presidency of the G20 has chosen are very, very appropriate. These are very important issues that are being discussed, future of work, infrastructure, and sustainable food. And so we think they were very well chosen. My question is related to the link of the work between the G20 and the United Nations. How they could reinforce each other. We are having, for instance, next week a very important meeting, which is the Financing for Development Forum, which deals with ways in which we could work to finance the SDGs, the agenda. We'll be analyzing the gap in terms of financing for the SDGs, and I wonder if you could develop a bit on the possibilities of increasing the synergies between the work in the G20 and in the UN. Thank you.
Well, the UN is actually participating. You have a Sherpa, Liu Jimin, the head of DESA, is the Sherpa of the UN for the G20. So the thing that the G20 is not intended to overtake whatever responsibility competes to the UN. The UN is the preeminent body for everything in terms of international community as far as Argentina is concerned. The G20 doesn't try to do the job of the UN. But these synergies that you mentioned are we're working very closely, and in fact you are providing us some assistance, us, Argentina, and the G20 at large, some assistance in identifying precisely what to do with the SDGs, how we can implement them. And this is the question of financing, which I'm going to pass to Laura, is of a critical importance, because the SDGs, if you don't have financing for them, they might not be able to actually be implemented. But we have to keep this close connection and working together. G20 and the UN doesn't mean that we are going to, each of us is going to take the role of the other. The G20, as I mentioned, is an informal mechanism for leaders of some countries and not an international organization. We don't want to become an international organization. We don't want to develop a bureaucratic infrastructure of the G20. And certainly we're going to be tapping into the UN and in many other international organizations, as you know, that actually provide inputs for the work, the technical work that we do. And the UN vis-a-vis the G20 is doing that precisely, being a technical advisor, if you like, because you have a lot of expertise, not just the UN, but the UN system. You have many of the bodies of the UN system, like the UNDP, UNICEF, FAO, ILO, all of them actually contribute, and very importantly, as does the OECD, to the work to the G20.
Thank you. So I think that each fora and each organization has its own mandate and comparative advantages. And of course, there are synergies and cross-fertilization between them, as Pedro mentioned. In the case of the G20, it's the most relevant forum for macroeconomic coordination and cooperation, and we have a mandate to boost and promote strong, sustainable, balance, and inclusive growth, and we are working on these priorities in particular that Argentina has set for this year, as they contribute for this sustainable and inclusive growth. So we think that embracing the opportunities of technology, it's a forward-looking agenda, and also contributing to closing the infrastructure gap will contribute to boost growth and make it more inclusive. And that's why it's in the mandate of the G20 to address these issues, as it's been in other presidencies, other issues that are relevant for that. In particular, on financing the SDGs, our priorities has something related to that. As you can notice, infrastructure financing is related to many of the SDGs and to giving access, also gender issues. And in the future of work, when we study which policy areas ministers and governors should discuss, and ultimately leaders as well, of course, the fiscal framework to adapt our economies, our institutions to this new era of technology has a financing component that we are discussing as well.
Yes, Alfredo Sirquis, Brazilian Forum for Climate Change. Both the Chinese and the German presidencies, they gave considerable importance to the climate change issue. What is going to be the attitude of the Argentinian presidency? Especially, you've mentioned the issue of infrastructure. It's very difficult to consider this issue without considering the issue of climate change. And related to the UN, of course, the UNFCCC is the adequate organ for deliberation on climate, but there is an aspect of climate change, which is the finance of the transition to low carbon or net zero economies in the future, that really the UNFCCC has a lot of difficulty addressing. And there, G20 has a very important role to play. Okay?
Thank you.
Yes. Well, you're right. In Hamburg, in the German presidency, there was lack of consensus precisely on some aspects of climate change because one of the key members decided to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. So, and being the G20 mechanism that works by consensus, of course, we have to take that on board. And I think it's only fair that we have to do that. I mean, but there are many other aspects of that are going to be being carried on. One of the ones is the one that you mentioned precisely. One of the priorities of the so-called climate sustainability working group under the Argentine presidency is precisely to align in international climate flows to implementations of the national determined contributions of each country. The question of also we have long-term low greenhouse emission development strategies, that's another of the priorities of that group, and adaptation to climate changes and extreme weather events. You mentioned the question of infrastructure, obviously has to be resilient. This infrastructure has to be also taking into account the extreme events that comes there. So climate sustainability is going to be very much into the Argentine presidency. Whether we are going to find consensus among all the members, that's another matter. And for that, of course, the work that people like your organization and others can do is do some advocacy on this. But it's also true that one of the crucial elements of climate change is that there is being the G20 involved directly with has to do with finance and macroeconomics. There is a huge business case to be made also on behalf of the actions that we have to adopt to tackle climate change in a way which is conducive for everyone. So I think that just to summarize the response to you, of course, is very much into the agenda of Argentina. We have divided climate sustainability as one working group and energy transition as another one. They were together in Germany, and that led to not only that, I mean, the fact that they were the two together, there was the lack of consensus in Germany applied to both in a paragraph, as you will know, that there was the chapter related to climate and energy had one paragraph describing the position of the United States, another one describing the position of the R19, and the first paragraph, which underlined the things in which all the countries of the G20 agree, which is a basis that we can work to as well. That's what's going to be part of my job as Sherpa, to try to see how we can steer the works of the proceedings of the G20 into something we can all agree. And that's an important matter. And also in the finance track, I think you have some things regarding also financing for questions related to climate.
Yes, in fact, we have a sustainable finance study group which deals with issues, not only environmental issues for financing, but also other social considerations. So we are also taking that into account when assessing projects to be financed. And I think that this issue and the others that you very well raised make this year very challenging, but also makes the G20 very relevant, given all the issues in which we have to look for consensus and to provide this forum and this space to discuss and try to reach differences is very important in contexts like the ones that you very well depicted.
Thank you. Thank you to the two of you. Well, we are running out of time. I want to especially thank Susan Segal and the Council of Americas for this opportunity. Our two friends, Pedro and Laura, now are departing to Washington to continue with their work. But I think their presence here today has contributed to a better understanding of what the Argentinian priorities are facing the G20 process, and the G20 summit will take place in Buenos Aires in November 2018. So I invite you to say goodbye.